There isn't just the one type of psychology, there are two, and each is the mirror image of the other. And what this means is, of course, that we can't ignore the fact that there is this pattern of two diametrically opposed ways of looking at things. Because if we assume that it's all just the one, then nothing is going to make any sense to us at all. Everything is going to become hopelessly confused, which is something we don't want, really. There's no benefit to being hopelessly confused. Our way of thinking about psychology is that it's a broad field, and that there's all sorts of little bits in it, little approaches, little theories, hypotheses, and that they're all legitimate and they all kind of add up to give some greater picture of things. We can kind of connect all the dots, we can join up the dots and make a big picture out of all the little things that have been said in psychology over the years. But that just isn't true, because they don't add up to anything. There's no real unity. It's just a bunch of stuff that has no, each thing has no real relationship with any other. Each formula, each theory, each hypothesis has no real relationship with any other. So it's a very messy kind of a situation. And in addition to this, stuff that really ought to be seen as belonging where it does belong, on the other side of the mirror, the mirror image psychology, gets incorporated with everything else, and that's just makes a nonsense of everything, because we kind of join together things that really can't be joined. And it's not a question of saying this statement is right and this statement is wrong. It's just that we need to realize which paradigm the statement comes from. So we say it's right in relation to this paradigm, it's wrong in relation to the other paradigm. So we're not making absolute claims for truth. We're just acknowledging that there are these two mutually incompatible, entirely incompatible ways of looking at psychology. So the first way, the first approach, and this of course has immense practical consequences in terms of what psychological therapy ends up looking like. So the first type of psychology, which we're all very familiar with, is the positive variety. We can say that positive psychology is totally valid as long as we accept the assumptions behind it, and the unspoken and unglimpsed assumptions behind it. And what these assumptions are is that our basic fundamental irreducible reality as people comes down to this thing which we call the ego or the self or the identity, and this is the bedrock. And so positive psychology comes out of that assumption that the self is the final word, and we need to make things as good as possible for the self or for the identity. And the task of psychology would be to look at everything in this way, and therapies deriving from the positive paradigm are there to deconflict as much as possible the type of problems that the self or ego is continually getting itself into, and thereby enhance the quality of the life that the self-based identity, the ego-based identity, is able to enjoy. Really, even though we're not prepared to acknowledge it usually, that's making the best of a bad deal. Because stuff can never be that great for us, just as long as we're operating on the basis of the ego identity, because a very narrow starting point, and no matter what we do, we're always going to be bringing that very narrow or constrained or limited starting off point with us. We can never evolve from it. Everything is just seen on behalf of the self, or on behalf of this particular viewpoint which we associate with the self, which we call the self. So basically, to put that a lot more simply, just say positive psychology is about fixing the self, correcting the self, allowing the self to do what it wants to do as far as possible. And from this starting off point, from this set of assumptions, I am this self, that makes total perfect sense. And it's fine. So I'm always trying to, in positive therapy, I'm always trying to enhance the life of the self, fix the self, empower the self, etc., etc. Negative psychology doesn't make this assumption that the mind-created identity is ultimately who we are. And so for that reason, it doesn't devote itself to the task of making the most of that situation. In fact, negative psychology and negative philosophy says that it is this notion that we have of being this particular concrete self that is standing in the way of our happiness, that is holding us back. It's not only standing in the way of being able to live life in a non-artificial way, it's also standing in the way of our being able to understand anything at all, because everything has to be seen through this very limited and ultimately untrue viewpoint, the conditioned viewpoint. So this means that mental health is being defined in terms of transcending that self, going beyond the self, seeing a bigger reality, and concerning ourselves with the bigger reality that we see when we take off the blinkers that hold us in so much. When we take off the blinkers, which we can equate to the thinking mind, and we see a much broader view of things. And we don't have this crude binary distinction between self and other, me and the rest of the world. That's produced by the blinkers. It's an artifact of our constrained way of looking at things. When we put the blinkers on, conventionally, way of looking at the world, bang, there is this self, and bang, everything that isn't self is the other. And there's this very stark duality, polarity. And in actual fact, it's the polarity which prevents us from living life in an unconstrained way, because the polarity doesn't exist, even though we base everything on it. Polarity doesn't exist because it's created by our limited way of looking at things. It is the limited way of looking at things. The world we see is a function of our unacknowledged limitation. The self I perceive myself to be, who I perceive myself to be, is a function of this unacknowledged limitation. And the end result of this is that if I carry on under this impression, under the impression that the polarity is real, then I'll never get beyond the polarity. I'll never go beyond it. And the polarity isn't real. So that is our fate if we don't gain any insight. Our fate is to be controlled by a polarity, defined by a polarity, trapped by a polarity, and that polarity isn't real. We know it's not real. We can see that it's not real. As soon as we drop the blinkers, there we are. That division, that boundary between self and other, it's gone. could say that's a bad thing. We will say it's a bad thing because our orientation is such that we are, in all the things that we do, we are defending, protecting the limitation that is us without seeing it to be a limitation. We're seeing it to be a limitation flipped on its head, the opposite of a limitation. In other words, great possibilities. So we see it to be the case that there are great possibilities for the ego identity. Therefore, we hold on to that ego identity because it's the gateway to all these possibilities. In actual fact, it's the gateway to no possibilities because it is an arbitrary limitation. An arbitrary limitation is not the gateway to any possibilities. Not how possibilities work. Possibilities come into being when we see that the arbitrary limitations imposed by thought are arbitrary limitations and we let go of them. So there's possibilities come into play as a result of what we don't do, not what we do. Everything we do is based on this very limited, inverted way of looking at the world. And as long as we're doing that, there are no possibilities because we're never going to emerge into reality from the unreal and mind-created hyper-reality, which is founded upon polarity, this and that. It's the playground of the thinking mind. Hyper-reality is the playground of the thinking mind. It can do its stuff there. It can reign unopposed. There's no higher reality, no higher ordering principle than thought. This is thought's domain. Sounds great, but that whole domain collapses to nothing as soon as we look at it because it's based on an unreal thing. To keep on saying that same point, the polarity is unreal, therefore the world that thought creates on the basis of polarity. In other words, boundaries, the polarity is boundary. You're inside or you're outside. You're with us or you're against us. You're this or you're that. Absolutely everything the mind does is based on that boundary. The principle of there being such a thing as a boundary. There is such a thing as a boundary in a purely nominal sense, in as much as I can sit here and I can say, let this be the boundary. I can define one class and another class and define them in a mutually exclusive way, and I'll say, here is a boundary, and I can do that. That's what thought can do. It can arbitrarily decide upon boundaries as much as it likes. But when we forget that these boundaries are arbitrarily put into position, then that's when we get lost in the hyper-reality. So positive psychology is part of the hyper-real. It's part of hyper-reality because in no way will it ever show up hyper-reality for what it is. In other words, that's like saying, in no way will it ever question its most fundamental statements, its most fundamental axioms. It'll build on them and it'll never question them. Can't question them because without those axioms, without those fundamental assumptions, which are, in whatever way they're constructed, they're all based on boundaries. So we don't really care what our assumptions are. We can lump it all together and say whatever our unglimpsed assumptions are, it's really just the assumption of polarity. So it doesn't matter what our assumptions are always wrong. So we might say, well, maybe, how do you know? Maybe I could assume non-polarity. But we can't assume that because we can't say it, we can't represent it. How can we represent non-polarity or unity? We can only present things and all the parameters are fixed and unquestioned, and that allows a kind of field of play in which things can be definitively understood or described or defined. As soon as we take away the artificial context of all the stuff we've assumed without acknowledging that we have assumed it, then the possibility of saying anything is gone. It's just openness. So in other words, we can't ever assume non-polarity because we can't imagine it, we can't conceive it. It means nothing to us at all. We can talk about it and kid ourselves that we've got a handle on it. But if we do that, then obviously we're completely deluded there, because non-polarity is the one thing that no one ever can get a handle on. That's the definition of it. It doesn't come with handles. It doesn't have any handles. So that's it, really. So as long as we remember that there are not, or there is not just the one type of psychology, but two diametrically opposed paradigms of psychology which are utterly incompatible, in one way at least, in the sense that positive psychology can never ever acknowledge what negative psychology is about. In the other way, negative psychology can perfectly well acknowledge what positive psychology is about, because it's not very hard to understand. And it's all a game. So certain premises are taken for granted. On the basis of these taken for granted premises, we can proceed in a certain way. That isn't a real way, and we can imagine that we're progressing and achieving certain points of that we could call accomplishments, or kind of marks along the road that tell us that we're getting somewhere in a kind of linear way. That's all. And moonshine, it's all hyper reality. There's no going anywhere. There's no measuring anything. There's no getting closer to the goal. Or there might be getting closer to the goal, as long as we remember that the goal isn't real. And so that when we do attain it, we haven't actually attained anything. Or rather, we've attained something in a kind of inverted way, since in order to be able to understand the goal or see the goal as being a goal, we have to limit our awareness so much. We have to incur a huge amount of entropy. We have to put the blinkers on. And that allows us to have a goal that is meaningful to us. So the fact that we have blinkered ourselves allows us to have a goal, so then we can have the pleasure of approaching the goal and the very great satisfaction of actually attaining it, maybe, or the worry of not attaining it, the fear of not attaining it, the disappointment and dismay of not attaining it. But that whole business is predicated upon me putting these blinkers on and then forgetting that I put them on. So, if we say that positive psychology is about perpetuating the world of the known, the situation that we know about, and that's going to be difficult, because even though we know about it and it's familiar to us, it isn't true. So it's always going to be under threat, really, from the actual reality. But we can't really afford to turn our backs on actual reality, because it's not going to go away. So in that case, we can say that negative psychology will always be regarded as completely nonsensical from the orthodox point of view, because not only is it the case that we totally don't see that the mind-created identity is an arbitrary limitation, we absolutely don't see that there isn't much of a possibility in us getting to understand that either, because we fundamentally don't want to.